The significance of number 1 Bassett Road is that it's a building that was owned by Amy Ashwood Garvey, a Pan-Africanist who worked in this area of London.
She seems to have been born with a flair for activism, with a flair for concern for other human beings.
The legacy of Amy is a proactive legacy, one of self-organisation of people of African descent, as well as being committed to unifying people of African descent with other oppressed peoples.
She was also the first wife of Marcus Messiah Garvey, one of the greatest Pan-Africanist leaders of our time.
Amy Ashwood Garvey was born in Jamaica around 1897. She was then taken by her parents to Panama, where she spent most of her childhood, and then returned to Jamaica with her mother.
As a child, she would take from her mother's kitchen and give to poor kids who lived in the neighborhood.
Amy came from a very well-respected middle-class home. She went to a private school, Westwood High. The school's very important because it was a school that was set up by Reverend William Webb, particularly for girls of all races. It was a challenge to the status quo of the time because dark-skinned girls like Amy would not have been welcome to such an education. Mrs. Webb, who was the wife of Reverend William Webb, told her that her poor people in Africa were suffering under heathenism and slavery.
And this was news to Amy. She had no knowledge of Africa. She had no sense of being part of a wider African global community. She wrote her father, who was in Panama, and asked him, what was this all about?
And he hurried back to Jamaica and took her to see her great-grandmother, Granny Dabbus.
And this great-grandmother is important because the great-grandmother was born in what is now Ghana in West Africa. The great-grandmother had been captured and enslaved, brought across the Atlantic to Jamaica as a young girl.
Her Ghanaian name was Wahima. She was fiercely proud of the military prowess of the Ashanti people and fiercely proud of her history. And this was a pivotal turning point in the racial consciousness of Amy. It made her proud to be an African thereafter.
Africans who were conscious began to think, hold on, we're not just Negroes whose history begins here, off the plantations in this new world. We actually come from a long tradition. They could often tell because they had with them bits of language, bits of musical practice, bits of dance, bits of African religious practice that reminded them, that told them, gave them the authority to know, actually, we're African.
Many years later, Amy actually went to West Africa, to Ghana, and was able to trace her ancestry based on bits of information that Granny Dabbus had given her. She was able to trace her ancestry all the way back to a village called Daman.
When Amy was growing up, Jamaica was still a highly racialised, socially divided society as a result of the legacy of slavery and the prevailing colonial system in Jamaica at the time.
Amy Ashwood was a debater and often attended debating meetings in Kingston, Jamaica.
To paint a picture of Amy Ashwood, one should think of a woman who was 5'1" in stature. She was hauntingly beautiful. She had impeccable dress sense. She was a captivating and charismatic speaker who was able to hold an audience in the palm of her hand.
She was a very bright woman, articulate. She was a great debater. She had a flair for, for public speaking and so on.
Amy met Marcus Garvey in August 1914 at a literary and debating society in Kingston.
Garvey met her, or at least saw her, while she was acting as the principal speaker in a debate. She was only about 17, but Garvey was so impressed by her speaking ability, her poise, her breadth of knowledge.
She was very unaware that the man in the audience who was supporting her position was Marcus Garvey until she went to the tramway, and it was then that she realised that he was the man who had been encouraging her and defending her during her talk, and actually declared that he was Napoleon and she was his Josephine. And that made a significant impact on her, and that's when the romance began between the two of them.
Garvey is somebody who says to Africans, raise yourselves up from under European white racism and imperialism and colonialism. Don't depend on the white man, if you like, to raise you up. Raise your black selves up. And if you want to raise your black selves up, remember that you have a history. Look to Africa. If you look to Africa, it means you raise your head, you stop thinking, I'm just somebody who has no history. but I have traditions, things to work off. And that is the big thing that Garvey does.
And that's the essence of Pan-Africanism, that African communities worldwide had much in common, historically, culturally. They had a common struggle for empowerment, especially in those days, that's early 20th century, when the majority of the African race was still colonized.
The Garvey movement sought to uplift the downtrodden and oppressed African people worldwide.
He believed in what he called race first, that people should put their racial self-interest first.
So Garveyism comes to be the most important ideology that diasporan Africans in the Caribbean get to hold on to.
Amy Ashwood Garvey was a very active Pan-Africanist in her own right, not just in relation to her life with Marcus Garvey.
They were ideological soulmates right from the beginning of their meeting. They had a common love for Africa.
She was one of the very first members of Garvey's organization. And for the first couple of years or so of that movement, the two of them crisscrossed Jamaica.
Amy played a critical role in the UNIA in terms of organising it, mobilising it and increasing its membership.
To this day, it remains the largest international African organization in history. There were chapters of the UNIA, his party that he formed, in Africa, in North America, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in Europe. It's extraordinary. And Amy Ashwood Garvey is the person alongside him who founds it, who plants the first seed.
She also subsequently became one of the directors of the Black Star Line Shipping Corporation, which again was established by the Garvey organisation with the aim of transporting people of African origin to Africa.
She helped him to start his famous newspaper, the Negro World, which became the most widely circulated newspaper, black newspaper, in the entire world.
The Negro World newspaper was the ideological mouthpiece of the UNIA. Amy wrote articles in which she sought to connect African people in Jamaica to African people on the continent.
And she became his fiancée shortly thereafter.
Amy and Marcus had a long period of courtship, around 5 years, before they finally got married on Christmas Day 1919. At their wedding, a huge number of family members and friends and associates from the UNIA attended to celebrate Napoleon and Josephine coming together.
They didn't have a very long marriage, unfortunately, divorcing only 2 or 3 months after they got married.
Factors that led to the breakdown in the marriage are complex. There were accusations of infidelities on both sides, as well as the fact that we have two very larger-than-life, magnetic and charismatic figures.
It is true that her marriage with Marcus Garvey didn't last for very long, but she continued to be concerned about, in a way, supporting the struggle that she'd initiated with him, but also having a claim to defining it in a way.
She tried to develop the woman's aspect of her ideas more when she left Garvey. On the one hand, she was burdened by Garvey's presence, and yet at the same time, she clung to Garvey's presence. It's a kind of a contradiction. She couldn't let him go. I guess she felt that he had been too important a part of her life and she to his.
She continued her Pan-African work around the world when she visited places in the Caribbean and in Africa.
In her whole life, she never spent more than 5 years in any one country. In the 1920s, early 30s, she had a stint in musical comedy production in the States.
She travelled widely around the world looking at the issues affecting people of African origin in her time.
When Amy arrived in London around 1932, the social facilities and services for black people were very scarce. She set up a restaurant at 62 Oxford Street, and she also ran a nightclub very near to Carnaby Street.
She called the club the Florence Mills Club, named after a famous African-American entertainer who died at a very young age, a few years earlier. Now, Amy in the 1930s was part of, one of the most important Pan-African cadres anywhere in the world.
The restaurant became a very important meeting place for some of Africa and the Caribbean's future leaders.
Where many political activists of the time would meet, have political debates, talking about political activity and actually planning events that would overthrow colonialism.
The whole of Africa, with the exception of Liberia and Ethiopia, had been colonised by all the European powers. Britain had the lion's share of colonial territories. African people were subjected to forced labour, and they were subjected subjected to extracting cash crops such as agricultural products and diamonds and tin and copper, Africans did not have a political voice.
She founded the Nigerian Progress Union, which later became the West African Students' Union, or WASU, one of the most important organizations in the history of Pan-Africanism. A lot of very famous people came through WASU. Kwame Nkrumah was a president of WASU at one time, and many other people like that. And Amy founded it in 1924.
We must realize that from now on we are no more a colonial, but a free and independent people.
She later went on to set up a boarding house at number 1 Bassett Road in Ladbroke Grove. She also offered a restaurant, it was a community centre, a welfare centre, as well as supporting private businesses such as laundry and catering services.
She also, in her community centre, which is here at 1 Bassett Road, provided housing, social advice for people who had come from the Caribbean, also people from the Americas and other parts of Africa, and here in the UK.
And wherever she went, she had that kind of impact. She toured the Caribbean, for example, in the 1950s. She toured West Africa in the 60s, in both places organizing women, building women's movements. So she had a great impact during her lifetime, and that impact was greatly facilitated by her constant travel.
Amy Ashwood Garvey has inspired me personally. When I was writing my book, Women in the Garvey Movement, I felt that she was someone who the world needed to know about in terms of her activism on behalf of women, her activism on behalf of African people across the globe. She was a champion in terms of political campaigning for the rights of black people.
What I find inspiring about the legacy of Amy is that she was a woman of persistence, determination and courage in a highly male-dominated world, and yet she persevered in her commitment to anti-imperialism and Pan-Africanism. And in the context and the era of the time in which she lived, she is a magnificent symbol and inspiration for women of African descent like myself, and women of all ethnic backgrounds.
It's interesting that the focus on who did what and who was important in the struggle gets wider and wider. It's important and significant that at last on that house where I first met Amy Ashwood Garvey, on the house at number 1 Bassett Road where she lived, there now sits a community plaque saying Amy Ashwood Garvey lived here.
Why is it important to recognize Amy Ashwood Garvey in a blue plaque? Because the community in which she lived and worked needs to remember her, and for those who don't know her, to learn about her, so that the present community can appreciate the history of the very community in which they live and the part that she played in it.